How's it going, you guys? So in this video I want to give some of my thoughts on Colin Campbell and some of his work, including the China study, which I bought this book for what, like $4 from my local thrift store, and also his book Whole. Okay, so I have read through the China study multiple times. I've also read the book Whole once. And this video is coming from somebody who was vegan for one entire year, back from 2014 to 2015. And then recently, well actually after I went vegan, I actually discovered I had a bunch of autoimmune illnesses that were triggered by the staple foods that I was eating at the time. And then I went on an autoimmune paleo diet, and all of a sudden all my symptoms vanished. Fast forward to 2018, I went strict carnivore for about 2.5 years, give or take, but then I experimented with carbs and different foods in the last year of that experiment and found no benefit whatsoever from eating plants and only side effects. So when I was vegan, I learned the scientific literature surrounding veganism like the back of my hand. So I was like really into studying all these vegan doctors, right? And after going carnivore and all this evolution, because that was over 5 years ago that I was vegan, I started to revisit a lot of this vegan science, if you want to call it that, okay? And so this is going to be part one of my opinion on the China study and Whole, okay, and basically Colin Campbell's philosophy and his work. So, first and foremost, one of the most widely referenced, widely talked about studies by Colin Campbell is a study done on rats, where basically he fed two groups of rats alpha toxin, which is a known carcinogen. And in one of those groups, he fed them a dairy protein, casein, and the other one, he fed them either nothing, or in a later study, he actually fed them like a vegetable protein or a vegan protein, okay? There are actually 2 studies he did like this, but anyway, what he found is in the group of rats fed casein protein, the combination of alpha toxin and casein protein, which, by the way, I believe the casein protein was fed to them in pretty high amounts that you wouldn't normally consume if you ate it as part of like cheese or something in a human. Regardless, though, they found significant growth of cancer cells in the alpha toxin fed rat group that ate the high amounts of casein protein. Whereas the group that was not fed the casein protein, they didn't have as fast of a growth of cancer cells. And in the group that was fed the vegetable protein, they didn't have growth of cancer cells either. So that study, Colin Campbell goes back to over and over again in a lot of his work. It was interesting to me reading the book Whole, okay? Because the book Whole, the entire purpose of it is communicating this message that reductionism, okay, reducing health, human health and medicine down to, you know, individual organs and individual nutrients and individual macronutrients like protein, carbs, and fat, or vitamin C versus, you know, reducing health and human nutrition down to these tiny molecules completely misses the point of the big whole. Okay, that's what Colin Campbell's book Whole is about. It's about seeing human health and nutrition and medicine holistically as the whole organism working in synergy versus its individual parts working in isolation. And the funny thing is, in that book about viewing health holistically and getting rid of the reductionist paradigm, Colin Campbell keeps going back to his research done on rats with the casein protein and alpha toxin experiment as evidence that animal protein causes cancer. Now, maybe it's my bias, but don't you think that it's pretty reductionist to look at a study done on rats whose metabolism is completely different than humans? In fact, they have specific metabolic pathways that actually make animal proteins, the certain nutrients from animal foods, more likely to cause problems. But regardless of that, do you think it's a little bit irrational to use an isolated protein from dairy products combined with alpha toxin, okay, something human beings generally don't purposely seek out, combine those two in rats, organisms that function completely different than humans, and then use that's a reductionist experiment right there, and then parallel that back to as evidence for health for humans, that animal protein causes cancer. That is a very far stretch, and that is not in alignment with the paradigm that Colin Campbell conveys in his book Whole. Okay, that is a reductionist experiment, and it's good if you use that kind of like as an understanding of possible mechanisms, but to use that as a main supporting argument for why you should avoid animal products for the prevention of cancer, or to understand animal protein in cancer metabolism within humans, it just is not, it doesn't add up. It does not align with Colin Campbell's paradigm that he believes in Whole. It's reductionist, and the biggest point here that most people would probably think, most rational people that are not stuck to any bias, they would automatically, red flags would come up when they're like, okay, a study done on rats, they're fed a carcinogen, and they're comparing an isolated dairy protein in these high amounts, like in a rat study, they're being fed, that is not really, that's not really, not really a rational comparison, okay? So there's that. That's the biggest thing, and it's like, that doesn't discredit everything Colin Campbell says. It's just very rocky from everything else here on out, when that's like the first thing that he talks about in this book, China Study. And then in Whole, he starts off kind of using that in a conversation about mainstream nutritionists and mainstream cancer therapies being biased and dogmatic and things. So anyway, as you continue reading, so the China Study more so is about a giant, basically a giant cohort study. Essentially, it's multiple cohorts. It's basically a cohort study. Or it's a prospective study. It's a giant study of populations in China. And basically what they found is the populations of people in China that eat the least amount of animal proteins had the least amount of cancer. Now, there's a couple problems with that study in particular. And mind you, the actual China Study is not necessarily the same thing as this book. This book is part of that. It's adding to the conversation, but the actual study is not the same. So within that study, they actually found, if you actually look at the data sets, you'll find that they actually found multiple correlations between increased consumption of grains, increased consumption of certain fruits and vegetables, and increased consumption of animal proteins, and correlated with cancer. They found multiple correlations that, for some reason, Colin Campbell did not talk about in this book. And if you use the data sets that correlate animal protein with cancer, then you have to also consider the data sets that show an increased risk of cancer from whole grain consumption and certain fruits and vegetable consumption that they found in that study. The other thing is, around that time when they were studying these populations, a lot of these populations that ate low amounts of animal protein, they did so because they lived in impoverished areas. It was because a lot of those areas that were eating low protein, they didn't have enough money to afford the protein. And so typically what you find in those types of populations that were living in poverty was high amounts of they were malnourished, essentially. They weren't eating a lot of protein, not by choice, but because they didn't have enough money to do so. And what you'll find is a lot of those populations were actually dying too young to develop heart disease and cancer and some of these other things. And so it's a matter of, did they live? Did they have low rates of cancer because of the low animal protein, or did they have low rates of cancer because they were so poor that they couldn't afford the animal protein and died of diseases of malnourishment before the age that people typically can develop the cancer? The other thing is that there's large amounts of smoking in all of those areas, or there was at the time, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that. And so cancer in general is going to be relatively high, as well as cardiovascular disease, specifically stroke, regardless of what you're eating. The other thing is that there were actually populations within that study that ate higher amounts of animal protein, and they had low rates of cancer. And for some reason, Colin Campbell didn't include those populations in his books. So it's a matter of, this man's interpretation of his rat study and this man's interpretation of the population study, the China study that they're talking about, versus the actual data sets and then all of the confounding variables within it. And this is the sad part about interpreting science. For 10 years after this book came out, all you would hear from vegan groups is, animal protein causes cancer, read the China study. Oh, you follow keto? Read the China study. Paleo people are stupid. They've never read the China study. And it's like, have you actually read the China study? That's what I want to know. Because when you actually read the China study, it's so hard for me to believe people read a rat study with alpha toxin fed rats. That's great evidence. I can't believe people could actually read this book and then be convinced fully that animal protein causes cancer. And it's just dairy protein. It's just a casein protein in the rat experiment. That rat experiment should not be convincing of anything, really. Especially not in regards to meat. Okay, eating meat. It's just, so we have a scientist who wrote a whole book called Whole about how we need to consider health and nutrition and medicine in the context of the whole human organism and see the whole picture. That's what his paradigm is. But then all of his arguments are based on these large population, this large population study with millions of confounding variables shows the less animal protein someone eats, the less cancer they eat. Not even taking consideration the whole picture of all the populations within that study, the whole data sets within that study, and then the whole picture of the lifestyle factors involved in cancer metabolism, and then also the whole picture surrounding his study done on rats given alpha toxin with isolated casein protein, not the whole dairy food humans would normally eat, not the whole human organism, a fucking rat. It's very incongruent. It does not align with his paradigm. So he's using reductionist arguments, despite even in this book, it talks about how you got to consider the whole organism and remove the reductionist paradigm. So I think that Colin Campbell has there's a lot of good stuff in these books, and I'm all for his model on medicine, And I also understand it's virtually impossible to really pull causation from any evidence on nutrition at all. Like mechanistic data doesn't do reality justice. Even clinical trials have confounding variables. So it's not like there's no such thing as perfect science. I understand that. But when we're trying really hard to villainize animal protein as causing cancer and stuff like that, it's not that he's saying it. He's really trying to infer that animal protein causes cancer based on a lot of these very flawed studies. It's better not to be so absolute in your arguments, right? So, but anyway, his model on medicine, his ideas and his paradigm on holistic thinking rather than reductionist thinking is very good. His book Whole is good, minus the propaganda about animal foods. And this book is very eye-opening too if you interpret the science properly. So I think I've learned a lot more from this book being from the paleo/keto carnivore community, 5 years later, compared to when I was vegan in 2014, 2015, I read this. When I was vegan reading this, I just kind of believed everything I heard. Well, actually, believe it or not, I was actually very skeptical even as a vegan. But I didn't learn as much as I did now, because now I actually can look at this book from the perspective of someone who was a vegan and someone who is now a carnivore or whatever. And so I can see it from two angles. And because of that, I'm gaining more insights and learning more about it. So, with that being said, leave your questions and comments down below. Let me know what you think. And I'm going to release a part 2 of this where I actually break it down in more detail and discuss it at a higher level. Let me know what you guys think about the China study and some of the topics. And let's have a discussion about whether it's credible or not credible, why. And I want more points. I don't want to just hear, yes it is, or no it's bullshit. I want to actually hear people break down the points, okay?